Welcome to the Intervention Hub Facilitation Skills training session. So now we know a bit about the theory and background to the Intervention Hub. We're going to go through some skills and things to be aware of if you are facilitating those programs. So we're going to start with the cycle of change. It's always a really good place to start with your service user, because it helps them assess exactly where they are, and you can work on their levels of motivation and gauge how likely they are to engage with the program. So there is a declaration at the beginning of each program which talks about that person taking responsibility for their behaviour change, and that's the kind of first instance you'll be able to ascertain how up for doing the program they are. What we would ideally like to see is that they are at least in the second stage on this diagram of contemplation. So they're beginning to understand that there are pros and cons to their behaviour, and that there might be benefits to change. If they're at the stage of pre-contemplation, then it's unlikely that they will be suitable for the programme. They might be saying things like, I don't need to change, I'm quite happy as I am, my behaviour doesn't impact anyone else. So that's going to be really difficult to work with that person. And you might want to think about what kind of exercises would be helpful to get them into that contemplation stage. So rather than telling them, well, I think it's a good idea you change, or coming from that stance, what you ideally want to do is to get them thinking about how they want to change and what reasons are beneficial to them. So it could be doing a tool such as a pros and cons list, looking at the pros and cons of their offending or their harmful behaviour. Hopefully then they will see that the advantages of change outweigh the disadvantages. The next stage is preparation. So that's when somebody's thinking about kind of preparing for that change. So it could be actually, okay, thinking about the agencies I want to work with, the appointments I'm going to make, what information I need to gather to make change, and then the actions is implementing that. So it might be going to a job interview, going to a drugs or alcohol appointment, meeting mentors or key workers. The maintenance is when they're beginning to do that as a daily activity, and it becomes less of a chore to go to these appointments and stick to these routines, but it actually is more lifestyle. The two parts of this cycle that we haven't included but are always there are lapse and relapse. So if somebody has a lapse, it might be that they fall off the wagon for a day, or they miss a couple of appointments and they're probably feeling quite bad about that, but they're able to pick themselves up and get back on that cycle of maintenance. However, if they have a relapse, they are likely to kind of fall back into those old habits, whether that be, say, alcohol, going on a massive binge and then feeling like they're at square one, or committing that offending behaviour. And quite often you'll see this in substances. What the focus should be in those cases is that going around that cycle, you want to prolong that stage of maintenance. And if they are managing to do that, you've always got something good to work with and to remind them that they can do the maintenance. So it's a case of starting back on that cycle, back to contemplation, those benefits of changing again, and the preparation and then action. So this is a really good tool to do at the start of a program, but also if you feel like somebody's motivation is waning, then you can do that in the middle of the program and share with them this cycle and ask them where they think they are and why, and do that work together. So motivational interviewing techniques are really positive techniques to encourage that individual to engage in programs, but it also develops that rapport with the individual. They're non-judgmental, and it's about planting that seed, so they are the ones that start to realize the benefits of change, and it's empowering rather than being told they need to change because their behaviors harmful to others. So some really easy techniques in terms of questioning is using open questions. I say that's easy. I know it takes practice to be aware if you're using closed questions, but essentially they are questions that can't be answered with yes or no. And what that does is allows them to give a full description. So it might be, tell me what happened. So they have to give a full description, or tell me how you're feeling, for example. Active listening, so that's about listening to what they're saying and then responding to what they've said rather than what you think they've said or what you would like them to say, and not being afraid to kind of use those pauses and explain that you're just kind of processing that or working that through. Not kind of thinking about our own agenda, so whether that be what we're having for dinner tonight or what shopping we're going to do, for example, is to be in the moment with that person, and that gives them a feeling of being valued. Empathy, so that goes hand in hand with being non-judgmental when you're using these techniques, but it's trying to put yourself in their position and share their feelings. And I think when you express empathy, for example, I understand that must be really hard for you, then I think it really helps build rapport and shows that individual that you are understanding their situation. Developing discrepancy is about highlighting those contradictions. Again, it's a subtle skill that's not about directly telling someone they've contradicted themselves, but highlights that back to them. So an example you might use is whereby you're discussing relationships with people and they say they never swear at their partner, and you know that's not true. So you say you never swear at your partner, and reflecting that back might then lead them to think, okay, well, there are times I actually do. So let's talk about that. Whereas it's more empowering to do that than say, oh, you're lying, I know you're wrong, for example. So self-efficacy, so that's always putting the responsibility on the individual to change. Again, that's something in the Intervention Hub Declaration, and it needs to be the goals that somebody wants to kind of achieve, and the areas of change has to be something that the individual buys into, and they're only going to do that if they set what they want to change and be in control of that. Affirmation, so lots of the individuals we work with are probably not really used to affirmation or kind of being told that or being praised rather for positive steps, but it's very powerful. It goes a long way, and I think again it contributes to that good professional relationship. Even again by acknowledging what they've said, I think it shows you're active listening. So affirmation can be used for more than just praise. It might take a while somebody to get used to that, but then when they do, they should give a really good response. Reflecting back, so that's just summarizing what they said, reflecting it back to them, and it allows them to unpick what they've said and explain things if they've not quite got it right, or they want to kind of elaborate on anything, and it gives that pause for thought and allows them to unpick kind of their feelings and go into a bit more depth. So all of these techniques support pro-social modelling, and that is behaving in a way that sets an example. So at a basic level, this is kind of, you know, being on time for staff, being courteous and polite, and being a motivational role model. So you may have attended the other part of the Intervention Hub training, which looks at the theoretical approaches behind the hubs. And one of those is a strengths-based approach. So that is concentrating on the individual's qualities and strengths, but also in their surrounding resources, so their families, groups and organisations, and using their personal strengths to achieve their goals in terms of change or rehabilitation. And this is really empowering, and it's highlighting to them that they have the capability and they have the skills that they need. They just may not have realised that or been used to kind of focusing on the positives of their personalities and skills rather than the negatives. So what are the benefits of a strengths-based approach? Well, it encouraged them to believe that they can change. Previously, we might have focused on risks and the negatives and ensuring those service users are aware of the risks they pose. However, this wasn't very motivational. It's quite hard to hear when you feel like you're being told off. So what people actually started to realise with a strength-based approach is that you weren't ignoring the risks, but actually by increasing the positives and the strengths and qualities, you were actually reducing risk anyway. So it does reduce risk. It enables rapport building, development of trust and respect, and allows service users to identify and build their individual and social capital. It increases self-esteem, particularly this is found with females, and psychological well-being, and reduces the risk of re-traumatizing the individual because you're not constantly focusing on the harmful behaviours. So there's some evidence that strengths-based approaches can increase retention in treatment programmes, and it's also likely to have a positive impact on engagement and motivation levels. So these are some really interesting and useful questions for implementing a strengths-based approach. Previously, we might have asked very simple questions around, for example, the negative influences of people. So you might say, who's your positive influences, who are your negative influences? And as you can hear, that sounds quite clinical and a bit tick boxy. Whereas these questions are really about that individual person and giving them the space to talk about their experiences. So these questions were devised by Salibi in 2016. And they say that asking questions like this will open up that relationship even more. So survival questions, for example, how have you managed to overcome or survive the challenges you have faced? What have you learned about yourself and your world during those struggles? So you can really see in the language to use the word survive really recognises what that person's been through. And we know that research shows that those service users we are likely to come into contact with are going to have had lots of traumatic experiences in their life. So it's important to acknowledge that without re-traumatizing. We have support questions. So who are the people you can rely on? Who has made you feel understood, supported or encouraged? So again, it's really focusing on how that person feels or how others make that person feel. When things were going well in life, what was different? What point in your history would you like to relive, capture or create? So sometimes we might ask individuals, did you have any periods where you weren't offending, and what were the factors involved at that time? This is more, again, about that story and listening to what elements they would like to take. So it's kind of the same question, but phrased in a much more warm way. Possibility questions, what do you want to accomplish in your life? What are your hopes for your future or future of your family? So again, that's looking at goal setting, having aspirations, lots of desistance theory in there in terms of changing your identity. Who would you like to be and how do you get there? Esteem questions, what makes you proud of yourself? what positive things do people say about you? So much of the time, these individuals won't have much positive to say about themselves, but they can put themselves in someone else's shoes and maybe give an opinion on what they think other people would say about them, which can be quite helpful. Perspective taking, what are your ideas about your current situation? So rather than being descriptive, it's helping that individual start thinking about how they might be able to change, not just describing their current situation, but how do they feel about it and what ideas do they have. And change questions. So what do you think is necessary for things to change? What could you do to make that happen? Again, that's about empowering that individual to take responsibility in a positive way. So all these questions could be additional ones that you might use throughout the hub, or they might fit in quite well. For example, when it comes to new tools, you can ask them to kind of add that into their plan of change, or even the reflection section, you can use some of these questions to help that individual apply the concept to that particular area. So using a trauma-informed approach, this is done through all our hubs, and that means we're kind of not wanting that individual to relive traumatic experiences, but we do recognise that they will have gone through those. And there is a way of making things trauma-informed, or at least with a kind of something that isn't going to cause that person stress and anxiety. So what is trauma? It's defined as any event that overwhelms a person's capacity for positive coping. And we could have a never-ending list of what those things might be. We've got a few here. So bullying, witness or victim to domestic violence, bereavement, parental abandonment and neglect. And what we do know is that all individuals respond differently to events such as these. So what somebody might find quite traumatic, another person might not so much. So it's just being aware of individuals. Again, the possible signs of trauma are something we often come across. So poor coping and or decision making, mental health difficulties, poor interaction or communication skills, substance misuse, use of violence. So this covers a wide range of the individuals we see, even if it's, for example, the poor coping and decision making. So given the high probability that we come into contact with lots of these individuals, it's really important to understand how we work with them in a trauma-informed way. So how do we implement a trauma-informed approach? Well, just by using those motivational interviewing skills, we can be really sensitive to this. And then we kind of giving them the choice whether they want to talk about it. We can ask about it, but just make sure that if you feel they need referral, for example, to a counsellor, you support them to do that rather than take on a counselling role themselves. Listen and maintain eye contact. Those that have suffered trauma really kind of struggle with things that are not clear, or where they're not clear on the boundaries. So it's really important to be transparent and open, clear about tasks and expectations, and to check their understanding. Again, going back to that self-efficacy, collaborating over those goals and ensuring that it's goals that that individual wants to work towards, and they can see why it's beneficial to them for change. That's really important. Adopting a strengths-based approach. Again, trauma-informed fits really nicely with a strengths-based approach because you're naturally gravitating to those qualities and skills, and also those achievements, and build those into problem solving, and that will increase their self-esteem and belief that they can have the capacity to achieve those goals. Really important to understand any cultural or gender issues that may add to case complexities. And this might be something that you can ask the individual about as well if you're unsure, and help the individual understand the basic principle of ACEs and identify any potential triggers. So, for example, to explain to the individual that as a person, when they grow up experiencing trauma, it can affect the way they deal with day-to-day challenges. So it can feel like simple things, so being out in a crowded street, being asked to fill in a form, can trigger an overreaction or a significant response, and that individual doesn't understand why. So just explaining that the traumas an individual goes through can lead to kind of poor coping with general day-to-day, I think is quite powerful in helping them recognise or understand why their response might sometimes be unpredictable, or they might struggle with certain tasks. Use of grounding techniques. So you may have heard of grounding techniques, and the one I like to use is when somebody is quite stressed or they're really feeling anxious, is to tell them to think of 5 things they can see, 4 things they can hear, 3 things they can smell, 2 things they can touch, something like that. And then that means that they break that kind of fight or flight response, and their thinking brain kicks in and it gives them pause for thought. So just explaining those kind of techniques, those interruption techniques, and how they might help and can buy that individual a few more seconds to calm down and ground themselves can be really useful. Of course, all our hubs are designed that they won't trigger that kind of anxiety response, but just to help that individual understand themselves and their reactions can be really useful for outside sessions and in coping with general life. So there's a really quick overview of the hub facilitation skills, and to find out more about those theories or practices, then I would suggest kind of doing some extra research. But the main ones that are really helpful is cycle of change. You have the motivational interviewing techniques, and the strength-based approach and trauma-informed approach. So good luck with the hub facilitation, and if you have any queries, then please get back to me. Thank you.